Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on the time zone you are in. For me, it is noon, so just about lunchtime. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining today. I'll go ahead and share my screen. We'll get started pretty quickly. I want to give people a moment. Um, I see it filtering in, so I just want to give people a moment. But in the meantime, I will share my screen and we will jump into it. But again, thank you for being here. Thanks for making the time, whether this is you first thing starting your day or you're getting a little bit of a break in your day to join us. We appreciate it. So, you are here today because you registered for our webinar, Why Classroom Data Collection Matters and How BCBAs Can Drive Change. What we are going to be focusing on today is what classroom data collection sometimes looks like, if it's especially an outdated or manual system right now, the improvements we see when schools transition to an electronic data collection system, and maybe most importantly, how to have that conversation with administrators or executives within your school and your district about the importance of utilizing an effective data collection system. What we hear time and time again from schools is that there's a barrier when talking about really the benefit of what that transition looks like. So we're going to dive into that. Before we get into the content for today, I do want to do a brief introduction. My name is Catherine Martin. I am a BCBA and an enablement lead with Motivity. So before I talk more about myself, a quick expert excerpt about Motivity. We are a all-in-one intervention management platform system for schools. We focus on clinical data collection, and we have a lot of tools specifically for schools that we'll dive into today towards the end of the webinar. But in case Motivity is new to you, it's important to know we are a electronic data collection system utilized by both private and public school systems. So a little bit more about myself. Like I said, I'm currently an enablement lead with Motivity, but depending on your role, I potentially have been in your shoes, which is why I'm so excited to talk about the topic of the webinar today. I have, I guess I got my start working at a small specialized school in Massachusetts, and I absolutely fell in love with ABA and working in school systems. From there, I've worked in in-home clinic, telehealth, providing ABA. During my time within the field, I've also worked at specialized schools, including residential and day programs, and then also in public schools. So, as an RBT, working in public schools within Massachusetts for my clients that receive services in that service delivery model. So, I've really been in a variety of different shoes when it comes to working in a school system, both working for the schools, consulting with schools, been a frontline staff and also a supervision role. So I understand what it's like when actually capturing that data from being a support staff, and then also what the difficulties in analyzing data when it comes to the school setting. But ultimately, the importance of capturing good, reliable data that you can have in the moment. So, absolutely talking from some of my own experiences here, but I believe that they'll resonate with you as they do with some of the other customers in schools that we've consulted with. So today's agenda, and more importantly, what I think the goal is today. So we're absolutely going to discuss some of the barriers we see with manual data entry systems, whether that's just an outdated system that you have, the platform you're utilizing currently hasn't evolved or doesn't currently meet your needs. We'll focus probably mostly on paper pencil. We do know that's often what schools are coming from, especially schools that have budget constraints. We'll talk about and highlight the importance and the impact it has when you utilize an effective electronic data collection system, and then finally reveal some of those hidden costs that are associated with outdated or manual data collection systems. So our goal for today is really to empower, whether you're a BCBA or an educator, for you to take information and data back to administrators, back to executives within your school or within your district to be able to talk them through why you're requesting for a transition to an electronic data collection system. For everybody here, it's probably really easy for you to pinpoint and talk about the challenges you're currently facing. Maybe that some of that being able to talk through the impact that an alternative system would have. But where we see that barrier can sometimes lead to is schools have budgeting constraints. We know that there's budgets that they need to fit into. And so what we hope today is to not just highlight some things that we already know is in front of your face because you're dealing with it every day, but also how to talk about that from a financial perspective when talking with administrators that need to work under a specific budget. And then finally, towards the end of the conversation today, we'll show what some of these tools look like within Motivity in terms of an effective electronic data collection system. So, the real problem. Like I said, I'm sure a lot of this resonates with those that have joined today. Like I said, I'll mostly be talking about paper systems, but this is also relevant for just outdated, even electronic systems that maybe haven't fully adapted or evolved to the needs of schools today. Paper data collection systems. The main problems we see with that is the delay and ultimately the time lost with students. So paper data collection systems, they don't just collect data, they delay it. What we see is that schools are losing instructional time every week, not necessarily because staff aren't going out and collecting data, but because these systems are difficult to access and they're easy to lose. So what I mean about difficulty to access, if you're in a supervision role or you're a BCBA working with a school right now, you understand that if you're utilizing a paper data collection system, that means whether you yourself or a different role within your school needs to go around and actually physically obtain those data sheets every day. If you're lucky, sometimes it's at the end of the week, and then go in and graph it. Only from there can you actually go in and analyze that data effectively. But like I said, I think you're lucky if you're doing that on a daily basis, and oftentimes that can happen towards the end of the week. And so you're really a week behind from looking at data and being able to make informed decisions. And so, like I said, it delays access to analyzing data. It's also instructional time left, which we'll talk more about. And then it's easy to lose, which we can also talk more about. But think about if you're working with a learner who has a history of property destruction, very often have I had my own paper data sheets ripped up, crumpled, scribbled on, ripped through with a pen, this, that, or the other thing. And so that's data lost. Or maybe you remember what the data was on there, but you're trying to go back and enter it. We also know that it's easy for clipboards to get dropped and left in another classroom and you walk away. Maybe you forget where it is because we're focused on our students and we don't know where that item is. And so now we've lost that. And so all of these things are very common when we think about outdated systems, particularly related to paper systems. But the root of that problem is when there's a delay to access to data, that delays our access to analyzing data, making informed decisions, and ultimately student progress slows. And that's the big barrier, and that's the big problem with systems like this. So to get into a little bit more detail, the challenges that we see are different gaps and delays. So data sheets get lost, damaged, left behind. We all talk about that. Now, I think it's important to note that even if you're utilizing an electronic data collection system versus a clipboard, you're also going to be holding maybe a tablet, maybe a phone-sized device, depending on the accessibility of the system you're using. And those can also just certainly get left. Like I said, I've worked in a residential and day school organization. And certainly when you are working with a student with severe behavior, you're going to have to put things down to make sure your hands are accessible. So that's the same with the clipboard as it is for a tablet. The difference is when you go back to that classroom and you realize, oh my gosh, I left my clipboard, you might not have the ability to actually go back and get it toward the very end of the day because you're still with a student and you can't maybe transition back with that student, or alternatively, now they're in an instructional environment and so you can't leave them or you can't ask them to go with you. The difference with an electronic system is if you have that tablet or if there's a different computer or tablet, if you're utilizing a system that is in real time, you can just pick up exactly where you left off. You can go get that tablet at the end of the day, find it when you need it, find it when you no longer have that student, but you can pick up where you left off with a different tablet that's maybe closer by to where you are, a computer within that classroom, or if you're utilizing a phone-sized device, something like that. And so there's a lot more accessibility about leaving something behind doesn't create this incredible barrier that it does for paper and pencil. The next, staff forget to print data sheets, and therefore you have entire days of missing data. I know back in the day, I would always try to make sure I was arriving to the school 15 to 30 minutes ahead of time to make sure we had all of the printed paper data sheets we needed, all of the copies that we needed. But there are things like traffic that happen, things like we miss our alarm or we're just running late. And so maybe you have to immediately get into the classroom and you don't have the ability to print the data sheet till halfway through the day, or maybe not at all. And you just kind of say, well, everyone tried to do their best to remember and we'll put it at the end of the day, or you start fresh the next day. And so now you have an entire day of missing data. That third bullet there, more materials to manage. I know that it can be, maybe it sounds silly because pens and pencils are small, but if you're a frontline staff and you're used to having to hold what your students need, what your own individual personal item needs are, and then additionally different tools just to collect data, that's more and more difficulty you have in just simple transitions day to day. It puts an additional burden on that frontline staff. And then finally, like we've already talked about, data often sits ungraphed for days or weeks, depending on whose role it is and the time that they actually have. Now, if you are somebody who does do it daily, probably you're spending hours after school just trying to get this done to just simply stay on top of the data itself, or you're spending weekend hours trying to do this. So even if you are able to stay on top of it, I have an incredible amount of respect for you. But unfortunately, like you, lately, you are spending time outside of your structured or your scheduled school day. And so again, the bottom line, if data isn't accessible, teams can't respond quickly to student needs. So all of these barriers result in a delayed access to actually looking at data and then making decisions in the moment to meet your students' needs. So the flip side of that, what happens when data is available immediately? What we see with electronic data systems that provide access to data in real time is that your teams can monitor progress daily. You could actually be in another classroom, pull up that student's data within your computer, your laptop, your tablet, whatever it might be, and in the moment, see what's happening for that student. I've worked with a lot of students that I'm sure people have here too that have reactivity. The moment they see you, the moment you enter the classroom, things change. So you're not really able to get a true observation or a true account what happens in their typical day-to-day when you are not there and you are not present. And so if you have an electronic data collection system that graphs in real time, you could be in another part of the school and you can more discreetly monitor that behavior and then make changes as needed, or just simply be aware that you need to consult with your team because you notice either a regression in skills that you're attempting to acquire for that learner, or alternatively, goals targeted for reduction, behaviors targeted for induction are starting to spike. That ties in directly with what we just talked about, the ability for BCBAs to adjust interventions faster. And then it also empowers staff to see whether strategies are working before problems escalate. So now that you've made that adjustment because you've seen you're starting to see a behavior escalate, you immediately come in, you modify your intervention to make sure it doesn't get to a crisis level. You could also see in real time, whether that's later on as the learner continues to work through their day, did you see that if were there additional spikes in behavior once you made this intervention, or just even throughout the week, being able to see if those modifications have adjusted. For me, as someone who has worked with students that are highly reactive to when I'm in the room itself, it's an incredibly powerful tool. When I was using paper pencil, if I wanted to have an idea of in real time, did the modification I made have an improvement on the learner's behavior? You're trying to peek through the classroom or look around the door without them seeing, simply to just do an observation. Now I could sit in my office and actually observe that behavior happening in real time, even look at narrative information, depending on the system you're using. And then finally, when you have graphs available in real time and you're able to make these adjustments, reports become so much easier. What we hear time and time again for different schools and educators, BCBAs, is that reports, instead of being an effective tool, often become a race against time. Can I get this report in when I was asked to do it? And that means after hours or weekend time spent trying to make sure your graphs are ready to be in reports, or just simply manually moving them, taking a screenshot or downloading a graph and then putting it into a report. So if your graphs are accessible in graphing in real time, accessible immediately, your reports become that much easier, not only in terms of their accessibility, but also how you're able to utilize them. And so you can have reports that get pulled for administrator requests, circling back to how to talk to administrators about your need for electronic data collection system. If you have parent questions or a parent requests access or information about their child's progress. And then, of course, to supplement IEP meetings, if you're analyzing IEP progress, and just in general compliance documentation, if you need to supplement information on what you're submitting in your IEP reports or IEP meetings. I certainly relate with this cartoon. I'm sure there's people here that do as well. Uh, Another piece when we think about accessibility is that last focus was much more on your the BCBA or the supervision type role focus about what it means to have access to data more easily. What this also means for your frontline staff, and as I said, I've been in those shoes, is just less juggling of things. And what we know is that if something is easier to do, if that response effort is lower, it is more likely to get done. In this case, we are going to see more reliable data. And so electronic data collections more effectively supports the reality of what we see in classrooms. So you don't have clipboards and other tools to manage. You don't have loose papers that you're trying to keep track of. No last minute printing. You can do it more discreetly than you can pulling out a clipboard, again, depending on the size of the device that you're utilizing. And this last or this fourth bullet here, I think is really important. It also improves consistency across staff and settings. Sometimes what we'll see with paper data, because staff have the ability to maybe write notes or collect data in different ways, because maybe it's you're supposed to indicate the prompt or the level of support that was provided, but instead you have a frontline staff doing a plus minus. When you have an electronic data collection system that presents the measures to them, there's no room for error there. And so, not just more data, you're also going to get more reliable data because the consistency and that integrity is shaped directly within the platform that's being utilized. All right. So the hidden cost, time lost equals support loss. Now, like I said, the goal for today, and we do have some resources that we're going to follow up with. So if you are a registrant, you can come in here and you can actually have tangible resources to take back and present to administrators about your reason or your need for an electronic data collection system. And so what happens is paper data, or again, outdated systems, potentially take time away from students. So even when paper data gets collected, paper ultimately creates a second job, and that's both for frontline staff and those educators or clinicians. So what happens is staff must sort, organize, and transfer data sheets. Somebody has to manually graph that data. BCBAs and educators need to track down missing data, and teams spend time chasing information instead of analyzing it. So if there's no data, you can't graph, you can't make adjustments, and student progress slows. Like I've said, all of this is probably things that everyone can relate to. Everyone's maybe had those discussions with their team, but often what we see that barrier and that maybe pushback from administrators is what does that mean? And maybe the advice initially is something along the lines of, well, let's just improve our systems already so we stay within the budget that we have. What we have right now is a budget for paper pencil. And so that's what we're going to try to utilize and continue to shape and improve and make better. But if you're somebody that's experiencing using paper pencil, you understand the barriers that you're hitting and you've tried to make those adjustments and you've just had difficulty doing so. So what we want to break through to administrators is talking about that ultimately these systems result in time lost for your team and less effective support for your students. Now, that's the real reason why we want this, but there has to be a number that gets associated with it because we understand schools are under budgeting constraints. And so, what schools are actually buying is time back. So, when we're spending less time managing these other systems, we're spending more time providing better student support. That means faster analysis, faster intervention, stronger outcomes. And then, like we talked about earlier, accountability. So, if you actually have the ability for clear documentation for IEPs, parents, administrators, and meeting state requirements, those are things that support what we talk about when we think of making this transition from a manual data collection system to an electronic data collection system. Now, as I just mentioned, we'll be providing a follow-up tool where you can have downloads to try to present this information to your team. Something that's maybe important to note about when talking about budget for your specific school is maybe if you have access to some of those numbers. I didn't include that here because I felt like it would just be potentially it could be inaccurate. So if you're looking for to present this to your specific school or your district, that budget is going to look significantly different. Both what you currently are paying for your system now, because again, you still have to pay to make copies. We've worked with schools that have, or excuse me, I've worked at schools where you actually have to pay a salary for someone to collect that data and graph that data. And so your budget and your school's needs are going to look a little bit different, but you can tie back here in terms of that ultimately what you're buying is that time back because that results in better student support and then accountability, both for those caregivers and compliance reasons when it comes to IEP progress monitoring and reporting on that. And just day to day, making your reports actually useful instead of something that you're just simply trying to beat the clock for. So, one of the takeaways is to just make sure that when talking with administrators and executives is to not let your system slow your students down. Like I said, I've been in both shoes, the frontline staff just simply trying to capture that data, and then somebody that's trying to graph it, support analysis, and both come with different barriers that we outlined today. And ultimately, if we can resolve some of those barriers by providing a more effective system to those that work in school districts, then there are a better impact on the students that you're working with. Okay. I hope that is helpful. If you are interested, absolutely not necessary, but if you are interested, I'll be showing a little bit about what these tools look like for an electronic data collection system where we see impact and power specifically within Motivity. So absolutely optional. The follow-up resource we'll be providing does not have any information related to that. But if you're interested in seeing what this looks like in our system, I invite you to stay and I'll show you what these tools look like. So the first thing that we highlighted in our discussion was talking about the impact that ease of use has on an individual, both in terms of the student progress, that BCBA analyzing that data, and then your frontline staff. So here what we're looking at is an individual learner, and these are the different goals that are being targeted for that learner. For ease, I have the ability if I want to filter. So if there's just specific goals or information I want to collect data on. So maybe the first section here is I just want to look at anything relevant to behavior. So if I have an ABC data tracking and we're specifically looking at off-task behavior, I can record the duration of the instance, where it occurred, what happened before, what happened after, and any additional notes as well. Maybe I also want to look at replacement behavior. So for this learner, we're looking at targeting behaviors for increase in terms of replacing or calming strategy. And so here we can see also a visual that supports both what your staff are maybe showing to that learner and what they need to see when talking about how to prompt that for your learner. And so it gives all that information. I've worked in schools where you had different visuals either on a keychain or I think mine was always clipped to a belt loop for me. So different visuals to present to those learners. So that's another material that you're hanging along with an electronic data collection system. You can embed it right within your programs. And so that's one less thing your team's carrying around. You'll also see for specifically when we think about behavior goals, accessibility in terms of just having them right on the bottom of the screen. So these are things that we're going to capture throughout this learner's day. And so I want to make sure I have access to it as needed when working with that student. If we want to look at different goals, we could also look at maybe I just need to see IEP goals relevant to the student. So we have an IEP meeting coming up, and I want to make sure that we're collecting data appropriately for these different goals. Now, accommodation tracking might just be simply to see if this learner is still utilizing accommodations that are currently outlined within their IEP. So this is really helpful when determining if this is something that is still appropriate for that learner. Also looking at things like dating teacher proximity. So with an electronic data collection system, we highlighted earlier, one of the important components of it is actually making adjustments in real time. And so what we see here is if your learner starts to require additional support, for example, the system can say, we're going to respond in real time to indicate that we actually need to be standing within a foot away of this learner, depending on whatever that goal is that you're working on. Finally, looking at a goal like transitioning between classrooms. Again, trying to remove some of what teams are holding when they're utilizing paper systems because there's no other place to store it. So giving your team all of the information they need. This tells not just what the goal is, but exactly how to support that learner, giving them a step-by-step of when we're targeting transitions between classrooms, here's some of the strategies we're utilizing to make these more likely in the absence of maladaptive behavior. So again, continuously making this easy for frontline staff, not in how they're capturing the data, but actually looking at individual goals and making sure they're run with integrity like we talked about a moment ago. Finally, you might use these labels to look at specific times of day. So this is something that I've worked in schools where paper pencil, we had a different tab in our binder or a different data sheet specific for times of day. So you can certainly translate that into electronic data collection systems too, if that's something important for the way your school functions or just the way your staff are currently used to collecting data. So you can maintain that preference, that ease, that structure, even when making a transition to an electronic system. And then finally, if I want to look at everything that the student is working on, I can also pull that up. If we look at this goal here, I can collect data. As we talked about, instant access to graphs is really significant. So here's another option for my transition. I can also pull up my graph. Maybe I want to look at everything that's been tracked across that date range so I can see when we transition to baseline today and what was actually scored. All of this allows you to start to make decisions for that individual. Same thing with calming strategies. I have the ability to view this graph. I can look at all the data that's been captured, and it informs decision making in that moment for that technician and that BCBA. Now, the last thing we touched on is reports and accessibility to reports. Within electronic data collection systems, you likely have multiple options when it comes to reporting, both pulling something like a note, maybe a daily summary about the school day to pass back to a caregiver. So indicating that the favorite activity was making a play animal during art, any sort of information about toileting that might be relevant for a caregiver to know how often that in their child produced, things that they ate, especially for a student that has more impaired communication, really important for parents or caregivers to understand if their child ate today and how much. So when they think about snack or dinner, they have more data when making decisions just inside the home themselves. Um, and then finally, any things that are needed, especially for working with a student that's working on toileting, there's always different things that might be important for a caregiver to access. And then finally, when we think about reporting more from a compliance-based nature, the last section I have here, there we go, Zoom got out of my way, is what those reports look like. So when we look like an individual learner and we see a different report, in this case, a quarterly or progress summary report, we can open this here and we can start to see information that is real time for this learner. Imported graphs, imported goal descriptions, having the flexibility to work on this report, knowing that it's saving for you, and not having to do that manual copy and paste like we see with Excel or paper data collection options. So going back to our slide deck here, the key takeaway and what's important to, again, bring back to administrators or bring back doesn't have to be administrators. Maybe there's others within your school that are finding it difficult to see the power of an electronic data collection system. And so the true takeaway when you make that transition is better outcomes, faster instructional adjustments, which support stronger IEP progress. We're reducing burden, so we're eliminating the second job of what it means to have paper and pencil data collection systems, and we're improving accountability. We have better documentation, better access to reports, better access to graphs, not just when it comes to making decisions about the data, but giving them to the people that need that, whether that's a parent, an administrator, or supporting an IEP meeting. And so the final thought I'll leave you with here is when data is easier to collect, easier to access, and easier to interpret, schools make better decisions and students benefit. Everyone will be receiving a follow-up resource. It will not be the exact slides today, but it will cover some of the information that we spoke about. Please feel free to reach out if you would like to talk with us more, if you have any additional feedback, but our team will be following up. And again, I really appreciate everyone's time today, giving you a full minute back in your day, whether you're just starting or you're taking that lunch break. So Thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate your time and have a fantastic day.